Jo has survived some of the most dangerous operations imaginable. She has sent soldiers into situations where the chances of coming home were almost non-existent. She has manipulated powerful targets, made impossible decisions, sacrificed people she cared about, and repeatedly carried the weight of those decisions without allowing herself to break. But now, the situation is different. For once, Jo is the one trapped. And that changes everything. The Season 3, Episode 5 trailer appears to set up a battle that isn't simply about whether Jo can physically escape Russian captivity. The much bigger question is whether she can escape without becoming part of the Russians' plan. Because the deeper we go into this storyline, the more suspicious everything becomes. Why does the enemy seem to know so much? Why is Jo still alive? Why does the Russian side appear to understand American intelligence behavior so well? And most importantly, what happens if Jo's captors aren't trying to stop her from escaping, but are actually waiting for her to make a specific move? That possibility could completely change the way we interpret Episode 5. So today, we're going deeper than the obvious trailer predictions. We're going to break down Jo's potential escape strategy, the Russian advantage, Alexandra's suspicious knowledge, Caitlyn's possible response, and the one theory that could explain why Jo's captivity may be much more important than it initially appears. One of the most fascinating things about Jo's situation is how much the power dynamic has changed. Normally, Jo enters an operation with information. She knows the target. She knows the environment. She knows what her team is supposed to accomplish. And even when things go wrong, she usually has some level of control. But captivity removes almost all of that. Jo doesn't know exactly what the enemy knows. She doesn't know how many people are involved. She doesn't know whether her location has already been compromised to other Russian assets. She doesn't know who is coming for her, and she doesn't know whether the Americans even know she's alive. That last point could become extremely important, because Jo's greatest advantage has always been communication. She can call people, she can send instructions, she can coordinate an extraction. But when she loses communication, she becomes dependent on her ability to improvise. And that is why I don't think Jo's escape will begin with violence. It will begin with observation. Jo is going to study everything. The guards, their routines, their personalities, their mistakes, the building, the doors, the cameras, the transportation, the moments when security becomes weaker. She will be looking for patterns, because Jo understands something that most people don't. A heavily guarded location isn't necessarily impossible to escape from. It is only predictable. And if the people guarding her become predictable, Jo can eventually exploit that. Here's one of the biggest possibilities I think Episode 5 could explore. Jo may deliberately make her captors believe they have defeated her. Think about psychology. If the Russians believe Jo is still fighting, they're going to remain cautious. But if they begin to believe that she is exhausted, isolated, frightened, or resigned to her situation, their behavior could change. They could become less careful. They could talk more openly around her. They could move her without the same level of security. They could allow certain people closer to her. And that is exactly what Jo needs. She doesn't necessarily need her captors to become stupid. She only needs them to become comfortable. That could be the first stage of her escape. Jo stops looking for the door. Instead, she starts looking for the person who can open it. And that person may not even realize what Jo is doing. Every intelligence operation has weaknesses. Even highly trained organizations depend on ordinary human beings. Someone gets tired. Someone becomes careless. Someone disagrees with an order. Someone wants money. Someone wants recognition. Someone wants revenge. And Jo is an expert at identifying those cracks. This is where her psychological training becomes more valuable than physical strength. She doesn't need to convince everyone. She only needs to influence one person. Imagine Jo discovering that one of her guards has a personal problem. Maybe that person has a family member. Maybe they're afraid of their superior. Maybe they resent the people running the operation. Maybe they're simply inexperienced. Jo could exploit that, not by openly asking for help. That would immediately raise suspicion. Instead, she could plant an idea, a doubt, a question, a piece of information, something that makes the guard start thinking independently. And once the guard starts making decisions independently, the security system becomes unpredictable. That is where Jo thrives. Now we get to the darker possibility. What if they know Jo would do exactly that? This is where Alexandra becomes so important. Because if Alexandra really understands the Lioness program and American intelligence methods to the degree we've been led to believe, then the Russians may already know how Joe thinks. They may know that she studies guards. They may know she manipulates people. They may know she looks for emotional weaknesses. They may know she prefers indirect solutions. And if they know all of that, they could build the prison around those weaknesses. That means every apparent opportunity Joe discovers could potentially be intentional. Every weak guard, every unlocked door, every strange conversation, every unexplained change in routine could be bait. And this creates one of the most dangerous situations Joe has ever faced. Because Joe has spent her career asking, what is the enemy hiding? Now she may have to ask, what does the enemy want me to find? That is a completely different problem. I keep coming back to Alexandra because there is something unusual about her role in this storyline. She isn't simply another character caught between the Americans and Russians. She appears to occupy a much more complicated position, and her knowledge raises questions that haven't been fully answered. How does she understand American operations so well? How does she recognize the significance of the Lioness program? How much information has actually reached the Russian side? And could someone within the American intelligence structure have indirectly exposed operational methods? I'm not saying there has to be a traditional mole. That theory is almost too obvious. There could be another explanation. The Russians may have spent years studying American behavior. They may have intercepted communications. They may have recruited sources. They may have analyzed previous Lioness operations. Or they could have someone with intimate knowledge of how the CIA thinks. And if that's the case, Joe isn't walking into a conventional enemy. She's walking into an enemy that has been studying the same playbook she uses. That makes her escape much more dangerous. This could be the real character challenge for Joe. She's spent so much of her career being the person who controls the situation, but now she can't. She can't simply call in a team. She can't order a strike. She can't rely on a heavily armed extraction crew. She may not even know where she is. So Joe has to become something different. Less commander, more survivor. And that could produce some of the most intense scenes of the season. Because Joe's greatest weakness may actually be her instinct to protect everyone else. She could find an opportunity to escape, but hesitate because someone else is in danger. She could discover information that might help her, but put another person at risk. She could have the chance to leave, but realize that doing so could expose her team. And that creates the ultimate Joe dilemma. Does she save herself, or does she protect the mission? Knowing Joe, she will probably try to do both. And that is exactly what could put her in even greater danger. While Joe is fighting to escape on the ground, Caitlin could be fighting a completely different battle. Because if Joe disappears, someone has to figure out what happened. And the longer Joe remains missing, the more difficult the situation becomes. Caitlin cannot simply send people everywhere. There are political consequences. There are operational consequences. And there is the possibility that the Russians are deliberately feeding the Americans false information. This could force Caitlin into an uncomfortable position. She may have to question everything. Who is telling the truth? Who is compromised? Who has access to Joe's location? Who benefits from Joe being rescued? And perhaps most importantly, who wants the Americans to launch an operation? Because if the Russians have captured Joe, they know the Americans will eventually come looking. That means Joe could become the center of a much larger strategic game. This is one of my strongest predictions for the next episode. Suppose the Americans finally locate Joe. Suppose Caitlin receives confirmation. Suppose an extraction team is assembled. Everything appears to be moving in the right direction. But what if the location is exactly where the Russians want them to go? That would be devastating. Because Joe's capture could then become a weapon against the CIA. The Russians wouldn't need to defeat the Americans directly. They would simply need to manipulate their response. They could control the information, control the timing, control the location, and force the Americans into making predictable decisions. That would turn Joe into more than a hostage. She would become bait. And if Joe realizes that before the rescue happens, she may deliberately sabotage her own extraction. Imagine that. Joe finally gets the opportunity she's been waiting for, and she refuses to take it. Not because she doesn't want freedom, but because she realizes the freedom being offered is part of the trap. That would be classic Lioness. There is another possibility that could completely change the story. What if Joe isn't the actual target? What if she is connected to the real target? Maybe the Russians don't simply want intelligence about the Lioness program. Maybe they want information about a specific American operation, a political figure, a military asset, a financial network, or someone connected to the 5 U.S. senators we've been watching. If Jo possesses information that connects these pieces together, then her value becomes enormous. And this could explain why she hasn't simply been eliminated. A dead Jo gives the Russians closure. A living Jo gives them leverage. And intelligence organizations almost always value leverage. That means the question isn't necessarily, why haven't they killed Jo? The more important question may be, what are they waiting for her to reveal? And this is where I think Jo could surprise everyone. If the Russians question her, Jo doesn't necessarily have to answer. She can ask questions too. She can watch their reactions. She can identify what they already know. And every question they ask tells her something. If they ask about a particular person, she knows that person matters. If they ask about a particular operation, she knows they're interested in it. If they already know certain details, she knows the information is compromised. So Jo could use the interrogation itself as intelligence gathering. The Russians think they're extracting information from her, but Jo may actually be extracting information from them. And that could give her the missing piece she needs to escape. There's another emotional element that shouldn't be overlooked. Jo has always been extremely controlled. Even when she is devastated, she tries to keep moving. But captivity is different. You can't control time. You can't control who enters the room. You can't control what happens to your team. And you can't control whether anyone is coming for you. That psychological pressure could force Jo into a decision she normally wouldn't make. A reckless decision. A desperate decision. And ironically, that could be what saves her. Because the enemy may have studied the strategic Jo. They may have studied the commander. They may have studied the CIA officer. But what happens when Jo stops behaving predictably? What happens when she abandons the plan? What happens when she takes a risk that nobody expects? That may be her greatest advantage. I also think we should consider something important. Jo doesn't necessarily need to run out of the building. Her escape could happen through transportation. She could be moved. She could exploit a transfer. She could create confusion between multiple Russian groups. She could manipulate someone into moving her somewhere less secure. Or she could escape during a moment when the Russians believe they're actually increasing security. That's why I wouldn't focus only on the obvious physical prison. The real opportunity could come when Jo is moved from one location to another. Transfers create chaos. Different personnel become involved. Information gets passed between people. Vehicles move. Communication increases. And every transition creates a vulnerability. If Jo is going to make her move, that could be the moment. Now let's go even further. What if Jo does escape, but the person who finds her isn't American? This would be a massive twist. Imagine Jo escaping into an unfamiliar area, injured and exhausted, expecting an American extraction. Instead, someone else finds her, someone who claims to be helping, but Jo doesn't know whether that person is actually there to save her. That would force Jo into another psychological battle. Does she trust them? Does she run? Does she fight? Does she follow them? And if that person has information about the Russians, Jo could suddenly realize that her captivity was only one layer of a much larger operation.